Welcome to the Big Bass Podcast, the fishing show where size matters. I'm Terry Battisti.
And I'm Ken Duke. Our producer and engineer is Nathan Benson, known to millions as the songbird of his generation. In this episode of the Big Bass Podcast, we're seeing spots. Spotted bass, that is. And we're digging into the state that's responsible for all, not most, but all of the biggest spotted bass ever caught. That state is Alabama. And it has been to the spotted bass world what Florida has been to the largemouth bass.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about, when did we discover the spotted bass? And it all goes back to 1881 with Dr. James A. Henshaw, as everything goes back to Henshaw, right?
Well, it does, but Henshaw just has this encapsulating sentence that I think really tells us everything we want to know about the scientific history of bass. And Terry, I know you know that quote very well.
Yeah, so what Henshaw said is the scientific history of the black bass is a most unsatisfactory one. That's his quote. And this is probably most true when it comes to the spotted bass. I mean, we're still debating today how many species are or genuses or whatever. I get those mixed up.
Well, genus is Micropterus. Yeah, you're talking about
subspecies.
Yeah, subspecies of the bass and so forth. Yeah,
but
below genus we've got species and then subspecies, and the spotted bass is so muddy. It was first probably discovered by a French naturalist named Rafinesque back in about 1819, and he called it Caliurus punctulatus, which meant dotted. And he probably thought it was just another largemouth, but obviously it was something different. And it's been refined through the years, and eventually in the 20s, probably the foremost biologist in the history of bass fishing, a guy named Carl Hubbs, really kind of nailed it down. He found he discovered the spotted bass from that perspective, and he broke it down into multiple subspecies. In short,
we got to talk about Hubbs even, we've been talking about Hubbs ever since we started this entire podcast, because it was Hubbs that, separated the northern strain largemouth from the Florida strain largemouth. So Hubbs was an amazing, ichthyologist back then. It was nuts.
Yeah, it was Hubbs who decided that smallmouth bass did not live in Florida. So you got to go back to our Walter Hardin episode to get a little up close and personal look at Carl Hubbs, but obviously one of the great minds of the sport. But anyway, there's a lot of scientific activity even to this day in the spotted bass category. 23 states currently recognize one or more of those spotted bass subspecies for their record-keeping purposes. But in this episode, we're only going to cover Alabama.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're going to start off.
And Terry, before we start, there's only one state that recognizes the spotted bass as its state fish. And you know what that state is?
Alabama.
No!
No!
Trick question. It's Kentucky. Gotcha.
Okay. So you got
I laid a trap for you.
Yeah, you got the Kentucky spotted bass, you got the Alabama spotted bass. I thought it was Alabama that... Yeah, okay.
Alabama's state fish is actually a largemouth, but it should be a spot. It's far more famous for its spotted bass, and it's produced far more impressive spotted bass than it has largemouths. But only Kentucky calls the spotted bass its state fish, while Kentucky should have the smallmouth as its state fish because that's where the world record smallmouth was caught. We just need to get into all kind of state
and not just
issues.
that. When you look at Kentucky spots, I mean, you get a 3-pounder. That's a huge fish. You get an Alabama, and you get fish that are pushing 12 pounds. So
now when we talk about Alabama spotted bass, Terry, as you know so well, we're really only talking about one body of water, and that body of water is Lewis Smith Lake near the town of Jasper, Alabama.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's 21,200 surface acres. It's got about 500 miles of shoreline. The deepest spot, probably at the face of the dam, is 264 feet. It started construction in 1957, and the dam was completed in 1961. Unfortunately, after Mr. Smith had passed away, he never got to see the completion of the lake.
Yeah, Lewis Smith was the president of the Alabama Power Company, and this is a hydroelectric facility, so he got it named after him. If you're ever wondering, who are these people these lakes are named for, most often they're named for some guy who was the head honcho of an electric company, believe it or not.
Yes. Yeah, or a governor or something like that. But
Yeah.
yeah, when you look at TVA lakes, a lot of them are named after the people that were somehow involved in the construction of that dam.
Yeah, some weird stuff. But only 4 years after the dam closed, Smith Lake was already producing world record spotted bass. But we're not going to start there. Actually, despite the fact that Alabama's spotted bass history is so tied to Smith Lake, the actual first reference to a world record spotted bass did come from Alabama, but it was from a place called Lake Payne, and it was by an angler named Wayland Heitch. And Terry, tell us a little bit about that one.
Yeah, so supposedly this fish was caught in 1950. It weighed 11 pounds, 8 ounces. And it was caught on a creek chub pikey minnow. And creek chub claims the record. At this point in time, there's still a lot of, people not knowing what a spotted bass was and blah, blah, blah. So, Payne claims this is the record, the biggest, spotted bass that's ever, been weighed in.
Yeah, and if
Heitch
you ever
actually
want to,
thought that he had an 11.5-pound smallmouth bass, or he did catch an 11.5-pound.
well, Heitch was an interesting guy. I'll say that first. And if you ever want to look at an ad and question whether or not the information in that ad is correct or legitimate, know that if it's a creek chub ad claiming some sort of record, it's probably wrong. It's probably just some fanciful imagination on the creek chub bait company's part. But they did claim that Heitch had caught this 11.8 spotted bass. When you look at the picture, it's clearly a largemouth bass. They had another ad with the same guy, Heitch, holding up an 11.5-pound fish, claiming it was the world record smallmouth bass. It's clearly a largemouth bass. He's also got some very legitimate looking giant largemouth bass, which he acknowledges as largemouth bass, including at least one weighing 12 pounds. So if this guy did all the stuff he claimed he was, not only would he be the greatest big bass angler of all time, but he would have a largemouth over 11, a smallmouth over 11, and a spot over 11.
Which nobody has ever done.
Which, of course, nobody's ever done. And that, but what's hilarious to me, Terry, is the fact that at some point in record keeping or record claiming history, a largemouth bass has held the title for largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass. So that's just all messed up. That was the first reference to anybody having a record spotted bass from Alabama. But folks, it's hollow, absolutely hollow.
But plus, Field and Stream wasn't even recognizing this spotted bass at the time.
They were not. They were not. Yeah.
They can claim all they want, and if you look at the picture, it's obvious that the jawbone goes past the eyeball, which tells you right there that it's a largemouth. It's definitely not a spot.
Yeah, there's nothing about that fish that looks like a largemouth bass.
Right. But then the first world record that was recognized, so Field and Stream recognizes the spotted bass in 1965, and shortly, or was it 64?
In 65, they didn't start to recognize the spot as for their record-keeping purposes. Yeah, because between 1911 and 1977 or 78, Field and Stream held an annual big fish contest, and what they would do is every once in a while they would go back and they would look at, okay, what's the biggest fish we've had submitted in the largemouth bass category, in the smallmouth category, in the rainbow trout category, and they would declare those fish to be world records. And that was it.
If they beat a pre-existing one.
If they beat a pre-existing one, and every couple of years they'd publish their new list of world records. And the spotted bass was nowhere to be seen, Terry, until 1965. Nowhere to be seen in Field and Stream magazine records, not even anywhere to be seen in their contest. You could not enter a spotted bass in their contest. And I'm not just talking about until 1965, I'm talking about ever. Field and Stream never had a category for spotted bass. And that's from 1911 all the way through 1977 or 78. Yeah, never had a spotted bass category.
Then, how do we go and say that, Eddie Simerall catches the first one?
Because Field and Stream was publishing lists of world record fish. They would publish it and they would say, oh, this is the world record smallmouth bass, but they didn't open it up to their contest. And we're we're going to get into the guy who pushed them into finally recognizing the spotted bass a little later in the program. But for now, just know that the first time Field and Stream took notice of the spotted bass and allotted it a world record spot was 1965.
Yep. And that was by a kid who, by the name of Edward Eddie Simerall of Jefferson County, Alabama. He catches a 7-pound even fish out of Smith Lake, Alabama. He catches it on a pink-eyed hellbender trolling on 6-pound. That's what blows me away about this record. Is you get a 7-pound smallmouth on 6-pound string.
Spot.
Yeah, excuse me, spot on 6-pound line, and a Johnson spin cast reel. Now, Johnson made probably the best spin cast reel ever, in my opinion. Zebco may have invented the thing, but in my eyes, it's always been Johnson that made one that was bulletproof. He was 14 years old and in the 9th grade at the time when he caught this fish. And newspaper reports had identified the fish as a spotted or a red-eye bass and said it's very similar to the largemouth. But the mouth only extends, or the jaw only extends to the front of the eye, whereas a largemouth goes all the way past the eye, which is absolutely one of the ways of identifying a spotted bass. And Eddie's fish literally lasts as the record for 407 days. One year, 1 month, and 11 days.
Yeah, we kind of are tracking how long these records hold up, because they don't hold up very long in Alabama back in the 60s and 70s. And Eddie Simerall, 14-year-old Eddie Simerall, his record lasts for just a little over a year. It's broken in 1966 by an angler named Bob Hamilton, who lived in Midfield, Alabama. He caught an 8-pounder from where? Once again, Smith Lake, Alabama. Not only Smith Lake, but what's called the Rock Creek area, which you're going to hear that name over and over again. So prepare for Rock Creek. This 8-pounder was 24 inches long, 18 and a quarter inches around. Again, he's using a pink-eyed hellbender, but Hamilton didn't like trolling. Some reports said he was trolling, some said he was casting, but I've seen more coverage saying he didn't like trolling, so he's probably casting that. And in fact, he had an Ambassador casting reel, and he was fishing alone out there, and he was a very skilled angler. This is a guy who went out there seeking a record. He had a plan. He had theories about big fish. And
there's a great write-up in the first issue of Bassmaster Magazine on it. I mean, they have, the whole story from Hamilton himself.
And it's very cool. You're right. It's like the third story in that issue, I think. And Hamilton tells about catching the fish, talk about making long casts parallel to a bluff bank. But there's a photo of him holding up the mount in that story. But Terry, there's also one of my favorite captions or cut lines in the history of any outdoor magazine in there. There's a picture of Hamilton's fish laying on top of a newspaper. And it says, "Note the size of Hamilton's record spot when placed on a regular-sized newspaper." What the hell, Terry? I think there should be a tradition, so that for all stories about record-sized bass, there should be something bizarre in there to compare it to. So, like, note the size of the record bass when placed next to this Toyota pickup truck, or Taco Bell chicken quesadilla, or the Empire State Building. We need something for scale, and I think that's what we need. So it's just a goofy picture of a bass laying on a piece of newspaper, but they had to make an interesting cut line out of it.
Yeah, it's kind of cool the way that people are doing it today with those big, scales that they're using and stuff like that. But it's not a newspaper.
Yeah, if you wanted to show the date, maybe a newspaper's interesting, but
yeah, exactly. Anyway.
So that's 2 world records, and the lake has been impounded for just 5 years, and it's already produced 2 world record spotted bass, and it ain't nearly done.
Yeah, but if you start looking at the growth rate, I mean, those growth rates are on line with the Florida growth rates that we had out of California.
They are.
That's great. It's crazy.
Oh,
I didn't. I saved myself.
almost said it. He almost, folks. We're going to start a Big Bass Podcast drinking game. Every
Yeah.
time Terry says
Every time
the
I say insane.
INSANE word, you got to take a
gotta
shot,
drink.
drink a beer, chug something.
Yep.
So world record number
Anyway.
3, because
Yep.
you know, Hamilton's bass lasts 3 years, and then in 1968, May of '68, an angler named Reefer James out of Arley, Alabama, clips Hamilton's fish by 2 ounces.
Yep.
Weighs 8 pounds 2 ounces, 25 inches long, 17 3/4 inches around, and again, it comes from the Rock Creek section of Smith Lake, Alabama. And Terry, it comes from a bait that I had never even heard of until I started researching this story.
Yeah, so it came on a Bill Norman Reb 2 in silver. The model number was 2001. The 01 was the color, so that was silver with a black back. And the interesting thing about this, if we can get on a little sidetrack here regarding Bill Norman.
Yeah, I wanted you to go here because of the whole Reb thing.
Yeah, so Bill Norman designed every single bait for George Perrin. And George
Perrin. Yeah,
is
go ahead.
the original owner of the Plastics Research and Development Company, i.e. what we call Pradco today. And so Bill Norman goes to work for Perrin in 61. In 62, they launched the amazing Rebel minnow. And come around 1967, Perrin and Norman get into a dispute for back pay, for royalties, and Norman walks out, and what does he do? He walks 3 blocks down the road, puts a shingle on the front of a building, and calls himself Rebel Manufacturing.
They're on the same street.
They're on the same street. He's using the name Rebel Manufacturing for his company, and what does he come out with? He comes out with the exact molds for the Reb 1 and the Reb 2. The Reb 1 was the smaller minnow. The Reb 1 was the smaller minnow. The Reb 2 was the bigger minnow.
Yeah, the Reb 2 looks kind of like a deep diving jerkbait.
Yeah, it's essentially, well, it's got a shallow running bill on it. But he also doesn't steal this. Now, remember, everybody, this is the baits that he designed for George Perrin. So he's saying, well, this is my intellectual property. And so he goes down the street, gets all the molds made, and instead of building the Rebel Humpy, he builds the Rebel, or the Rebel Manufacturing Little Scooper. And a whole bunch of baits that if you looked at these baits, you would swear they were Rebels. But they're not. Not only that, he takes the color of the packaging and makes it nearly identical. And he calls his bait the Amazing Minnow. It was absolutely insane. They went into drinking. They went into a litigation where Perrin was telling the court that he's copied all of my stuff, and Norman is saying, well, I didn't copy it. It's my intellectual property. They're all my designs, but he owes me $18,000 in back pay. And when it came down to it, Norman got slapped with having to change his lure company name, having to change his packaging, and Perrin had to pay him the $18,000 in back pay. So, and they operated literally blocks away from each other for 20 years.
A crazy story that you can only get on the Big Bass Podcast, folks. So
yeah, and I actually have a Reb 2. It's sitting right here. It's at this point in time, it's when he's changed his packaging. This is a vintage 71 Reb 2, but now it's called the Bill Norman Linebacker, and in a couple years it's going to be changed to the Bill Norman Shiner. So
yeah, and you cannot tell that from a Rebel.
No, the eyeball is a little bit different. That's it.
Well,
anywho, So
when Reefer James catches this 8-pound 2-ounce spotted bass out of the Rock Creek section of Smith Lake, he thought it was a largemouth, and he said, "Well, this is a big fish. I haven't caught one this big before. I want to take it to the taxidermist, get it mounted." So he put it in the freezer, and it was only when he took it out weeks later and took it to the taxidermist that the taxidermist said, "Hey, this is a spotted bass," and the taxidermist contacted the Game and Fish office and got it officially identified, and they reweighed it and all that stuff. So Reefer James suddenly had a world record, and it was only just the third or fourth issue of Bassmaster magazine. I think, the third issue of Bassmaster magazine. Reefer James is on the cover of the fall '68 issue, and Ray Scott, being the consummate promoter, even used Reefer James and his world record spot to promote an upcoming tournament. It was the Dixie Invitational Bass Tournament on Smith Lake later that year, and there's a paragraph in that article about trying to drum up interest in the tournament, trying to get people to sign up and fish it. And the quote is, "If you ever had a dream of catching a world record bass, you won't have a better chance than at the Dixie Invitational Bass Tournament." Yep. Which I thought was pretty hilarious, that they're using a world record fish to promote bass tournament entries.
Well, it was his second tournament ever. He hadn't even formed bass at the time, right?
Well, no, he'd formed bass.
No. This is
yeah.
Excuse me.
This is like the sixth or seventh tournament.
67. I'm not firing on all 8 cylinders tonight, Ken.
Yeah, this is like the sixth or seventh tournament. And this tournament, this is a tournament that Bill Dance won. It was Bill's third win, I think, and he crushed them. He crushed the field. He wound up, his winning weight was 48 pounds 3 ounces. Second place was Tom Mann, 20 pounds behind him.
Yep.
It's still one of the biggest, ugliest, nastiest beatdowns in major tournament circuit history. Bill just dominated. And to me, Terry, there's another interesting thing there. Having worked at Bass for a long time, I used to keep track, and still do keep track, of what goes on the cover of Bassmaster magazine, and I know you know the answer to this. So Reefer James and his world record spot are on the fall '68 cover of Bassmaster. Do you know the next time a world record fish appeared on the cover?
2009.
2009 with Manabu Kurita. 41 years later. Did it have to be that long? No. There had been changeovers in the smallmouth bass record, and there had also been numerous changes in the spot record, but it was 41 years before Bass ever put another world record on the cover.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't understand that. I mean, I think it's bad marketing. Those spots that were, caught out of California were worthy of being on the cover, but,
Well, and all the others that came out of
even the others that
Smith
came out
Lake.
of, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Why he didn't, choose to put those on the cover? Maybe it wasn't his call. Well, I would think that it would be his call.
It probably would have been Ray's call or Bob Cobb's call at that point. One of those guys would have been able to do it. As far as the California spots that came along in the 80s, 90s, and since then, there's been other editors in charge. But a lot of opportunities to put a world record on the cover. It just hasn't been done. Bill Norman and Norman Lures ran an ad for the Reb 2 in that issue, and plugged the fact that it caught a world record. And Ray Scott actually, on the cover of that magazine, which we'll show you a picture of, you see Reefer James holding up his mount. Ray Scott actually used that mount in his promotion and trying to get people to come out to the traveling seminars that Ray and John Powell and Bill Dance and Roland Martin were doing in the late 60s and early 70s.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, then we got another fish that is a mystery fish. I mean, where the heck did this fish come from? It was caught by Harvey Sims Sr. of Moulton, Alabama, again out of Smith Lake, Alabama, again on a pink eye hellbender.
How did they keep him in stock, Terry? How did they keep the Whopper Stopper hellbender in stock at Smith Lake?
It's Smith Lake. Yeah, exactly. I mean, probably every pink eye was going there, and that kind of sounds kind of contaminated or something. I mean, my kids had pink eye a couple times. It's like, get away from me. Anyway, this fish supposedly weighed 8 pounds 12 ounces.
So yeah, it would have beaten the Reefer James bass by 10 ounces.
Yeah.
But that is the only. It was never acknowledged as a world record by Field and Stream. It was only referenced as a record in an advertisement from Whopper Stopper in Bassmaster magazine. This guy Sims was a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, and obviously a person of some important magnitude. But that is the only reference that I've been able to find of that fish. And Terry, I don't think you've been able to find anything else, have you?
No, absolutely not. I mean, you look at that. It's an ad that's in Bassmaster magazine, I believe, and
Yeah.
there's nothing else. There's nowhere else in the world that you can find anything on that fish. I have never seen anything.
What I love about the fish, Terry, what I love about the ad is this guy.
You can't really tell its dimensions. It's
Harvey
like
Sims. No, it's well that's
it's
cool.
sitting
But
on a table.
yeah, it's sit on a table. You can't tell how close Sims is to it or anything like that. But I love the look on Sims's face. I have seen mug shots of criminals who look happier than this guy who's allegedly standing in front of a world record spotted bass. He looks like he's about to be charged. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe that's the deal. It was a fraud. Who knows? I don't know.
I hate to think a guy with those kind of credentials would be guilty of a fraud like that, but maybe it was a technicality of some kind. But
Yeah.
it was never acknowledged by Field and Stream. It was never officially recognized as a world record. The couple of things that make it seem legit are A, this guy was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and B, came out of Smith Lake.
Exactly. Yep.
And as did our next world record.
Imagine that. So we have Billy Henderson, Fairfield, Alabama, on February 25th, 1972. He catches an 8-pound, 10.5-ounce spotted bass that was 23.5 inches long and 19 and 7/8 inches in girth. Again, from the Rock Creek area of Smith Lake. But this time, he doesn't catch it on a pink eye hellbender or a Norman bait. He catches it on a 3/8 ounce Cordell buck jig, and with an L3 Pedigo lizard pork on the back, black on black.
And he catches it at night.
At night. Good color to be thrown at night. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, February at night. You know, not a lot of people go fishing after dark in the dead of winter, but Henderson was out there. It was around freezing, out there fishing with his brother in the Dismal Creek area, Rock Creek area, Dismal Creek area of Smith Lake. And once again, Terry, they've got an issue. They don't recognize it as a spotted bass when they catch this fish at 11 p.m.
No. Well, I mean, they catch it at 11. They weigh it in at 3:30 in the morning at world-famous Huey's Marina. Now, all these big fish, I have a feeling, came through Huey's Marina. And I actually have a patch of Huey's Marina that says home of the world record spotted bass. It's a pretty cool patch.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah. Have you ever seen that patch?
I have not seen that patch.
Oh, man, I got to find you one. I'll find you a patch.
They did take it to Huey's, and they woke up the proprietor, Mr. Huey himself, and turns out he didn't have certified scales, so they went to a place, I think it was called the Trading Post or something, and they got it weighed on certified scales there at 330, comes in at 8 pounds, 10.5 ounces, as you say, and it's a new world record.
Yep. And his record lasts for 6 years.
Yeah, his record goes quite a while.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And that's unusual. Actually, no, Terry. Here's, and you're right. In a sense, his record lasts 6 years, but in another sense, his record lasts 7 years, because when a bigger spotted bass comes out of Smith Lake, when a bigger spotted bass comes out of anywhere, it's actually March 18, 1978. But for reasons we're about to go into, That fish is not recognized as a world record for almost another year.
Yeah, and again, it's a mistaken identity, right? I mean, it was caught by Philip Terry Jr. in Decatur, Alabama. This fish weighed 815. It was caught March 18th, 1978. Again, where was it caught?
Rock Creek area of Smith Lake.
Yep. And this time it was not caught on a jig. It was not caught on a hellbender. This fish was caught on a spinnerbait, a single spin spinnerbait in yellow and black. And on 17-pound Stren mono, a loose speed stick casting rod, and an Ambassador 5000 or 5500C.
Good stuff.
The Philip Terry at the time is 15 years old, and he's in the 9th grade. You know, take a kid fishing. That's all I can say.
Yeah, keep him out of my boat. I don't want him catching world records right in front of me. That's humiliating.
Yeah. Well, he was fishing with his dad, Philip Terry Sr., and Smith was their home lake. And the day that the spotted bass, they caught that big spot, Philip Sr. catches an 8.3 largemouth, also on a spinnerbait. And that is what made Junior tie a spinnerbait on, and literally on the first cast of his brand new rod and reel.
Well, actually, this was the first fish he caught on the rod and reel.
The first fish he caught on the rod and reel.
Yeah.
Yeah. He catches that big spot. I mean, that's
crazy.
Pretty damn cool. Not only that, it was his first fish over 5 pounds. So he had a couple of personal bests, in that around. So
yeah, I hope he still has that rod and reel. Philip Terry, we know you're out there.
Yeah.
We'd love to have you on the show. Give us a call. Email us. We want to hear from you. We want to have you on the program if you'll do us that honor.
So they weighed the fish at the marina. I'm assuming it's probably Huey's again. It weighs 8 pounds, 14 ounces. And they really wanted that fish to weigh 9 pounds. So they took it to a supermarket that has a certified scale, and it weighed 815. Unfortunately, they probably lost a couple of ounces in transit and stuff like that. Philip, I'm sorry, man. Still, an 815 was a huge, huge fish back then.
It's a world record.
Yep. So Philip wanted to mount the fish, but he didn't have the money. And so what did they do? They stuck it in the freezer. And
they still don't recognize. They still don't know it's a spotted bass.
Yep.
It's 3 or 4 months later. Before they take this fish to a taxidermist. In the summer, they take the fish to the taxidermist. Remember, he caught it in March. In June or July, it goes to the taxidermist. And the fish is finally ready shortly after Christmas to be picked up. And Philip had the money to pay for it. So they picked the fish up, Terry, on January 2nd, 79.
Yeah.
And shortly after that, the taxidermist says, "Hey, that's a spotted bass, right?"
Yeah. So at that point, what do? They call Field and Stream. They learn that IGFA has a requirement, that you've got to file all this stuff within 60 days of the catch. They fill it out anyway.
They fill it out, even though Philip Terry's application was 253 days late.
Yep. Yeah. And they fill it out. They send it into IGFA. And literally every day after they sent that letter off, Philip Terry Jr. would run home and check the mailbox to see if they got any word from IGFA.
Yeah, he'd leave school at lunchtime, go home just to check the mailbox.
Yep.
And finally, Terry,
on tax day, April 15th, 1979, he got a letter from IGFA informing him that he had the all-tackle world record for the spotted bass.
I cannot imagine how cool that would be for a kid to get a letter like that.
That's why we need to have him on. If we can find him, that would be an amazing story to hear from the mouth of Philip Terry.
Yeah, when I realize there have been a lot of anglers who have beaten that 9:15 mark now, but when I think of the world record spotted bass, I still think of who have beaten the 8:15 mark. But when I think of the spotted bass world record, I still think of Philip Terry. That's the first one that pops into my mind because it has been broken so many times in California. The ink doesn't get dry on the certificate when it gets broken in California, and now the record is over 11 pounds.
Yeah, and when I think of it, I got to agree with you, Ken, because when they stuck those fish in Paris, we started seeing those fish go from 6 to 6.5 to 7 to 7.5. It was always Philip Terry that was in the back of your mind to break it. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. When I think of the spotted bass record, I go back to 1979, and that's the first thing that comes into my mind. It's like George Perry. George Perry's have been ingrained into our heads for so many years that when you think of the world record, even though Manuba Kurita has eclipsed it, when I hear world record largemouth bass, I think of George Perry instantaneously.
Well, Perry still has a share of it. He shares it with Manabu Kurita, and we're going to, oh my gosh, I can't even wait till we get into that story, Terry. It's going to be like 74 episodes on the largemouth. Yeah. But, going back to Philip Terry, 15 years old, he's got the world record for spotted bass. He's been walking home for lunch every day from school to check the mail. He finally gets the letter. He calls his mom and dad. They come. They're celebrating with him. He had a biology test in school that afternoon. He had a biology test, but he was too psyched up, too keyed up to go back. And in a great story written by Steve Price for Bassmaster Magazine, he was quoted as saying, "I was so excited about the world record, I'd forgotten everything I'd studied for on that test. The only answers I knew were spotted bass and world record." And man, I can imagine that would be exactly the same way.
Yeah, I would have, pleaded with my teacher to let me take it, tomorrow. Oh man!
Now,
what are the odds?
Depending on whether you're an Alabaman or a Californian, the story either gets sad then or takes an upturn. But because that's the last world record spotted bass that has come out of Alabama, the last, and that's 5 in a row. 5 spotted bass in a row from 1965 to 1978 coming out of Smith Lake, Alabama. That is a run on world record fish that you just don't see. And I want to change gears here for just a moment, Terry. We've been talking about the anglers, we've been talking about the catches, we've been talking about the species and Smith Lake as a spotted bass trophy factory. Yeah. But in digging into the story, one of the things we've discovered is that the real hero of this story is not the anglers, at least in my opinion, and it is of all things an outdoor writer.
Imagine that.
Yeah, our last episode, folks, if you're watching these chronologically, was about the history of the Ohio largemouth bass records, and that's a situation where a bunch of outdoor writers have, in some instances, kind of muddied the waters and maybe done some weird things. But here's a situation where an outdoor writer did a great thing. Yeah,
so you've got Jerry Bryan, who is the sports editor of the Birmingham News, and he was the sports editor for more than 40 years. And it's Grits Gresham is a name in bass fishing. I mean, Grits Gresham was synonymous with bass fishing in the 60s and through the early
and the 70s.
Early to mid 70s.
All the way through the, oh my gosh, wait a minute now. Are we gonna dare say the brand of what? Well, Grits Gresham became most famous not for any of his outdoor writing, not for any of his shooting. He was more of a shooting guy probably than a bass guy, but he did write a book on bass fishing. But what was was it Miller Lite that he did the commercials with?
Oh God, yes, yeah. Those were awesome commercials.
They were good, and I'm glad they were Miller Lite and not another brand that's been in the news lately. But yeah, if you haven't seen them, just go to YouTube and search Grits Gresham Miller Lite or Bubba Smith Miller Lite, and you'll go back to the 70s, and it was this back and forth debate between stars of these various industries and sports about whether they wanted great taste or less filling. I think was the debate.
Yeah, that was the deal. But they had one that was bass fishing.
They had Grits Gresham on there. Yeah,
it was just a great series of bass fishing, or a great commercial on bass fishing for Miller Lite.
Anyway,
Gresham states that Jerry Bryan is the guy who deserves credit for getting these outsizes, in betweens. The spotted bass is about midway between the largemouth and the smallmouth in physical characteristics into the record books. It's all Jerry Bryan. And this is Rich Gresham, who's got the pulpit when it comes to bass fishing in this era.
Yeah, and as far as newspapers go, he was widely syndicated. He was living in Louisiana, but he was syndicated in a lot of papers throughout the Southeast. And when Rich Gresham took up your cause or threw your name around in one of his columns, it was a big deal. And he pointed out that Jerry Bryan was the one who got the spotted bass recognized, because Jerry Bryan pushed Field and Stream into recognizing spotted bass as a worthy fish for record-keeping purposes. He publicized the fish in Alabama. He researched them to make sure they were spotted bass, and he made sure that all these potential record catches, were being properly checked out by competent fisheries biologists so that the record would stick and be official. Because as we mentioned earlier, prior to Jerry Bryan's efforts, Field and Stream did not keep records for spotted bass, and spotted bass were never part of the annual Field and Stream fishing contest. Without Jerry Bryan, there is a very real chance that it might have been a long time before Field and Stream ever started keeping records on spots. And it might have been so long that 0 spotted bass records could have come out of Alabama. 0. Because IGFA would have picked up the records in the late 70s, early 80s, and it might have been years before they decided to recognize the spotted bass.
Yep.
Fortunately, Jerry Brown lived to see the fruits of his labors. I'm sorry, Jerry Bryan.
Not Jerry Brown was
not
governor
was
of California.
Multi-time governor of California. We don't need to talk about that. Jerry Bryan, my apologies. Jerry Bryan lived to see the fruits of his labors and lived to see several Alabama spotted bass recognized as world records. He died in 1968 at the age of 65. And fortunately, he didn't have to see the world records go to California, Terry.
Yeah, because after Philip Terry's fish, everything goes to California, and the northern strain spotted bass from Ohio, they were introduced early into California in the 30s, but those fish don't grow as big as the Alabamas. And in January of '74, 129 Smith Lake, Alabama spotted bass were transplanted into Paris Lake in Southern California. So Paris is in the Inland Empire portion of California, north of San Diego County, south of LA County, east of Orange County, and it's essentially a big round lake that's got deep, clear water. And they put those fish in there, and it was it didn't take long. They put
game
them in
on.
70. Yeah, it was game on. I mean, I remember, the big thing to do down there was you go take crawdads, and they had to be 2.5 to 3 inch soft shell green crawdads is what those spots loved. And you'd fish them on 6-pound line, 8-pound line at the max, fly line them with no weight, and you'd go down there with 4 or 5 dozen of the crawdads and catch fish. And February 5th, 1984, Jeff Matthews catches a new world record spot from Paris, and it weighed 9 pounds, 0.96 ounces. I vividly remember when that happened. And at this point in time, in the early 80s, I mean, you're seeing 25-pound bags of spots come out of Paris, 5-pound average caught in tournaments. I mean, it was on, and from there it just kept marching up. So
yeah, since then that record has been surpassed many, many times, but always and in different reservoirs, but always in California. And we're going to tell the story of the California spotted bass records one of these days. But you can't talk about world record spots without first diving into Alabama and particularly Smith Lake.
No, you can't. I mean, it because they all came from there.
Yeah, that's right. Every spotted bass world record since they've been kept beginning in 1965, has been a fish that you can trace directly back to Smith Lake, Alabama.
Yep.
And
yeah, it just amazes me because the Paris fishery got clobbered back in the 90s, probably the mid 90s.
they introduced largemouths to it, didn't they?
Well, they introduced
Or
Florida. Well,
Floridas. I'm sorry, Floridas.
What happened, to my knowledge, is the lake. They went through another severe drought situation. They lost 3 or 4 spawn years.
Oh, we should save this for a California episode.
Yeah, we should. But yeah, then someone bucket biologied some Floridas in there, and because the problem with Paris, the Floridas exploded and killed Paris. But they were smart enough to get some fish and take them north, and that's where the story will pick up when we get to that.
Yeah, we'll cover California soup to nuts before too long. But we had to get Alabama done first. And Terry, your takeaway, the Alabama spotted bass story and history.
Oh, it's a phenomenal history. I mean, for them to finally recognize the fish, get a world record established, that it did come out of Smith Lake, which deservedly, Smith Lake gets full credit for that fish. And I'd like to talk to a biologist sometime that is an expert in spotted bass and ask them, why is it the Alabama and not the other 2 or 3 strains of spot? Why do they grow bigger? What is it about that? Is it the watershed that made those fish different? I don't know, but they're an amazing fish. And if you ever caught a 5-pound spotted bass, it's a bigger deal than I think catching a 5-pound smallmouth.
I don't think there is a harder fighting fish
No.
than a spotted bass. It's not my favorite, but I don't think there's a fish that fights harder. And and spots aren't known to jump much. If a spot jumped, if a spot jumped, it would probably become perhaps my favorite of the bass, but it doesn't. So largemouth rules.
What do you think?
Well, I think that Alabama's claim to fame in the bass fishing world, as far as I'm concerned, is the spotted bass. It's not anything else. It's not anybody else. It is what Alabama and their subspecies of the spotted bass has meant to the bass world. That's their ticket. And kudos to Jerry Bryan, the outdoor writer and editor who pushed this through, who deftly navigated his way through Field and Stream to get the spotted bass recognized and to get it into their world record books. Because without him, who knows? A lot of these Alabama spotted bass that were so huge that became world records might be totally lost to history. But because of Jerry Bryan, we're able to tell this story. So thank you, Jerry Bryan.
Yep. Well, you think it's about time to slam the door on this one?
I know it is.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining us on this episode of the Big Bass Podcast. But before we go, please remember to subscribe, like, give us a comment or review. We love talking to you guys, on the YouTube chat and comments. Don't forget to check out the website at thebigbasspodcast.com. There you'll find supplemental information on these fish that we talk about. You'll find the Big Bass Podcast calculator, good for largemouth over 14.5 pounds. You'll find state records, world records for all 3 fish, spots, largemouth, and smallmouth. If you want to contact us, our email addresses are Terry at thebigbasspodcast.com, Ken at thebigbasspodcast.com, and Nathan at thebigbasspodcast.com. I'm Terry Battisti, and on behalf of my partners Ken Duke and Nathan Benson, thanks for joining us. Be sure to check us back next week. We'll have a new show about a different big bass with a story that you will not and cannot find anywhere else. And remember, size matters.